everyone, and welcome back. This week I am finally officially getting started on the next historically accurate cosplay, that of Gonzo from the Muppets Christmas Carol. Now, if you don't know the Muppets Christmas Carol, it's pretty simply the Muppets retelling of the classic story, The Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens and originally published in 1843. And when it comes to doing the historically accurate part, well, a lot of the work's already done for me. Despite the fact that this is a Muppet movie, it's fairly accurate. There are obviously going to be changes made because everything is scaled down into a much smaller format, and it has to fit a fairly weirdly shaped body with noodly appendages. It's going to need to function differently and fit differently and have different structure. It's going to lose a lot of detail. So that's where I'm coming in. I'm filling in all of those gaps and seeing what this actually would have looked like if it had been worn by a human body during that time. Now, Gonzo is supposed to be playing Charles Dickens himself as the storyteller, which is a really fun concept because you actually have someone carrying you through the story, but also in the fact that while Gonzo is dressed in a fairly elaborate and flashy, almost gaudy ensemble, Charles Dickens was also well known for being a dandy and well known for being somewhat flashy with his clothing and loving a really wild waistcoat. So I love the fact that that's actually fairly historically accurate unto itself, and it really does support the fact that the outfit is fairly accurate. So in my last video, I dived into a general look at the fashions of the 1830s and 40s for men, and with this one we're going to really get nitpicky about each different part. So there are a lot of parts in Gonzo's outfit that I'm going to have to do. We have shoes, stockings, trousers, shirt, waistcoat, cravat, a regular coat and an overcoat, and a top hat to top it all off. So I don't know how I've managed to take on this much work and thinking I can get it done by the end of this year, but I'm going to try. And it's gonna be fun. So I'm starting with the shirt because it really is the most important piece in the entire wardrobe. And that's because everyone had something like this. They had a shirt or a shift. It functioned as their undergarment. It was something that they had many of because you needed enough to be able to put it in the laundry after every day. It's your underwear. For men, they generally weren't wearing a secondary undergarment that was a bifurcated lower body thing. They simply had a long shirt that they tucked between their legs as they put their trousers on. So this was your full body underwear. You kind of need to only wear it for a day at most. If you're particularly sweaty or doing hard work, you might want to change it out more regularly. So you're going to need a lot of these because unlike today where we generally do our own laundry, it was very common, especially in big cities, to have your garments that needed to be laundered sent to someone who specifically did laundering. And so you might not get them back for a few days. So you need to essentially have two different sets, one that you're wearing through and the other that's in the laundry. And you probably don't want to be doing that every couple of days. So most of the time people are going to purchase quite a few of these. They're sold by the half dozen and dozen most regularly. You can get individual ones. Obviously, sometimes you'll have a need for a really fancy one or a really fine one that you don't need a bunch of, but at least being able to buy your everyday shirts in bulk is pretty typical. So it's not uncommon to see people saying that they have 12 shirts or 20 shirts at this time. And because shirts need to be mass manufactured in order to meet this demand, there's a pretty interesting system set up by this point. Now, obviously, the concept of mass manufacturing that we're used to today includes usually a lot of machinery and large warehouses full of lots of people doing repetitive tasks where they do one thing and hand it off to the next person. And that will come for shirts. However, in the 1840s, we're still dealing with hand sewing only. There are sewing machines being invented, but they aren't really effective enough or popular enough or cheap enough until the 1850s to really revolutionize how we're making clothing. So shirts from the 1850s might be very commonly mass-produced in a warehouse by lots of women sitting down at sewing machines. But in the 1840s, it's a little bit different because you don't have to have that sewing machine involved. Therefore, you don't have to have a physical location for all of these people to come and do the labor. And I do have to specify it is mostly women doing this because it is an unskilled labor that does not require a lot of strength. And it's a skill that both men and women know how to do, but it's a pretty ideal circumstance for women. Now, I do have to specify this is not women making garments for their own family. That is very, very uncommon still at that time. It's not until we get to the end of the 19th and early 20th century where machines and innovations and changes in family structure and all sorts of things actually give women the free time and the information and knowledge how to make things like their own dresses. So those things are still being made by tailors and gown makers, people that had trained for years in order to know how to cut, fit, and pattern. It's complicated. So women aren't making that in the home. They might occasionally make things like shirts, shifts, and children's clothing and accessory items, but usually that is for women that have free time. It's not usually for women that are doing it out of necessity, because usually it's better for them to go and try and earn a wage doing something else. So shirts being made in the home is something that women are doing as a business. It's something that they can do alongside of other things that need to get done around the home, and it's something that is considered socially acceptable for women to be doing as a job. The problem is, not surprisingly, that companies really love to hire women and children because they don't have to pay them very much. They pay them next to nothing. And the moment I put shirt in as a search term for newspapers and magazines of that era, it came up with a whole lot of controversy really fast, because apparently there was a lot of discussion about the fact that these women were paid so very little that they could not survive off of that. It might work under the ideal circumstance of a family who is earning enough money to get by and a little bit of extra is desired. But for a lot of these women, they don't have somebody else in the household supporting them, and they might even have children that they are the sole supporter for. So they're not going to be earning very much out of this. And it became a huge controversy that was printed and talked about at great lengths. Before I get into the actual numbers, because I know that the vast majority of my audience is American, I'm going to have to take a moment to break down the British monetary system. We have the pound, which is pretty similar in modern day to the US dollar. And then from there, we break that down into 20 shillings to the pound, 12 pence to the shilling, and because we're going far enough back, we have 4 farthings to the pence. So summing that up really fast, if we're talking about a farthing, there are about 1,000 farthings to the pound, and if we're talking about a pence, there are about 240 to the pound. So really basic overview there. Now, these women are usually making anywhere from 1 to maybe 4 shirts in a day, ideally. And these are, if you're making 4 shirts, 16 to 18-hour days. Some women say that they work straight through the night in order to manage this. And we're looking at 6 days a week. So that's a really long week with a lot of working hours. And they are making usually anywhere from about 1 to 3 pence per shirt made. The way this works is that the fabric is sent to the woman, she makes up the shirt, and she sends it back and is paid by the piece. She is responsible, however, for the thread, needles, and other supplies needed, so she's going to be losing a little bit of money on each one of those shirts, even if she's getting paid out the full 3 pence per shirt. So under ideal circumstances where she's able to focus on this all day, she's able to work that 16-hour day and get 4 good shirts made, and she's getting paid that full good amount of 3 pence per shirt. That is only 12 pence per day, or 1 shilling per day. So probably coming out at 6 shillings a week, because usually people weren't working all 7 days. They took Sunday off for church and other things. So assuming 6 shillings a week. What does this mean? It means it's not much. It's really difficult to actually put value to these things, because our budgets have changed so dramatically and how much items cost has changed so dramatically. Food is a lot cheaper for us now because we can grow it in a lot easier ways and we can travel it around the world really quickly and easily. Food is very cheap for us today. Whereas we're spending a lot more money on things like a car and having to put fuel in it and pay for electricity and computers and cell phones and cell phone service and TV and all of those things, many of which are absolutely necessary in our day-to-day lives. They didn't have any of those to pay for. So they had a very different budget system set up and things cost a very different quantity. What I'm going to give you though is the price of bread, a pound weight of bread for a family that would usually be purchasing one of these a day pretty regularly. Mind you, this doesn't include things like meat or cheese or vegetables or a roof over your head or clothing or anything else. But this loaf of bread in London around this time would usually come in at 1 to 2 pence. So about the cost of what these women are usually making for one whole shirt being stitched up. And having hand-stitched these sorts of shirts before, that is... The fact that they can manage it theoretically in 4 hours just absolutely blows my mind. I've never managed that. That's just crazy. I don't know how they're doing this, but that's a lot of work for one loaf of bread. No. So, not surprisingly, even people of the era were pretty shocked that women were earning that little money while doing that much hard labor, because even though it's not requiring you to do a lot of heavy physical labor, and it's not requiring a great deal of skill and trade, it is a repetitive task. It's not good for your eyes, it's not good for your hands, it's not good for your back. It will give you repeated stress injuries. And they acknowledged this in the time period as well, that this is something that can physically do damage to the people that are doing that much constant labor for so little. And if it's not already sounding bad enough, if these women are not able to support themselves or support their family, they will end up in the workhouse. And if they go into the workhouse, odds are they're going to be making shirts still. They will just only be earning a farthing per shirt. Remember, that's 1/4 of a pence. So that became a major headline, a farthing shirt, and there were even like poetry type things written on how poorly off these women were and how terrible this job is and everything about it, how little they're paid. So like the Victorians always are, they're super dramatic about it, but it is a valid thing to be a bit dramatic about because it's pretty terrible that these women were earning so very little for this labor. A really interesting comparison that I came across when I was researching Charles Dickens himself is the fact that he actually went into the workhouse at age 12. His father, who was in the Navy, spent more money than he earned and ended up in debtor's prison. His wife and some of the younger children joined him there, but Charles himself was just old enough that he actually went to board with someone, and in order to pay for boarding, he had to go into the workhouse and take up a job. He worked at age 12 in a boot blackening factory where he put labels on the pots of bootblack. He earned 6 shillings a week doing this as a 12-year-old boy, putting labels on pots. It is a tiny amount of money, but that is the same amount of money for what was usually a 6-day work week and about 12 hours a day that those women under the most ideal of circumstances were earning with their 16 to 18-hour days making 4 shirts at the best possible payment. So, it all sounds pretty terrible, and it is. And this was something that was a major controversial topic at the time because not everyone did support the fact that, like, they needed to get paid more money for this. Obviously, the businesses wanted to keep earning a bunch more money because these shirts were being sold at anywhere from 1 to 3 shillings or even more. So we're talking 12 times the cost of what these women were originally being paid to make the shirt. Obviously, a fabric has to be included in there, but it's definitely not that much. And these companies wanted to keep that going. They earned a lot of money off of this, and lots of people thought it was good extra work for these women. It's good to keep them busy, and there are a whole bunch of things that tie into issues with how the poor were treated in Victorian England, and the idea that they had to work themselves out of this, and that if you gave them too much money, they'd be idle with it, and they'd go do stupid things, and they'd be far worse off. You just need to keep them working really hard, so you shouldn't pay them too much. There's a lot in there. But this all really centered around shirts pretty regularly, and it's a conversation topic that didn't go away. There were still issues with shirts being made by women throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a great example of the terrible working conditions that came around as we moved further and further into the Industrial Revolution. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, for example. That's something that still shows that even almost 100 years later, things really had improved for the women making shirts. So this is a big topic of the era, and it's something that Charles Dickens was highly aware of because not only had he lived the experience of a workhouse, but he also was a major advocate for the working class. He was a major advocate for lots of what at that time were very progressive things. In 1842, as he was doing a tour around the United States, and this is actually while he was starting to work on A Christmas Carol, he was also publishing a great deal of writings on the anti-slavery movement. He was incredibly just horrified by all of the things he saw with slavery. So he wrote about that. He wrote about all of the economic issues and poverty issues, class issues, and workhouse. I mean, Oliver Twist was written because he had personal experience, and the vast majority of his books were written because he had personal experiences with those sorts of situations and people. So he was very proactive about this and very outspoken about it. So this is very likely something he would have been acutely aware of as he was going and purchasing his dozens of shirts. Because as I said, he was pretty fashionable. So he definitely had quite a few shirts, as most households did, because it was such a necessary item. Because even if people understood the ethical issues of the production of these shirts, they still needed them. So this is a problem, obviously, we're still dealing with today, the ethical manufacturing of clothing and still needing those clothing items in order to function, something that they were dealing with at that time as well. And for this reason and many others, the shirt is an incredibly complex and important garment in the wardrobe. It was obviously a necessary part of the daily life for everyone, whether they were making these shirts or not. But when it comes to my making of this shirt, it's a bit of a difficult era because it is a transitional era, meaning that we are moving away from the style of shirt that we're used to seeing for, say, the 18th century, with the open bosom slit, all hand-stitched, made out of a fine linen, and we're moving into more and more cotton becoming available and popular, mixing cotton and linen in the garments depending on what's more expensive and the quality of these things. You start seeing changes to the design, so there's more and more going on in the front area, what we call the plastron section. So pleats are becoming very popular and common, sometimes ruffles are, or longer cuffs over the hands. All sorts of changes in style are occurring throughout the 1840s. And since shirts are something that aren't really easy to put an exact date on, it's kind of hard to know exactly when some of these changes took place. I can say that shirts in 1843 would have been entirely hand-stitched, and I will also admit to you that what you're going to see in this shirt as I'm making it is a lot of machine stitching. Because unlike those ladies who were apparently so incredibly skilled that they managed to get a shirt out in 4 hours entirely by hand, I can't do that. I can't. So I did a lot of this by machine because some of these seams would just be long backstitched seams and they would function the same by machine, and quite frankly you won't see them once I have all of my layers on. So I did choose to hand stitch some areas over others. I also chose to do a cotton rather than a linen because I can find a good fine cotton today. I got mine from Dharma Trading and it is the cotton broadcloth, which is still commonly used for shirts today. And I chose that rather than linen because linen is really hard to find that fine, and it's gonna look a little clunky if I'm doing all those pleats in the front, which is something I decidedly wanted to do because I don't have a shirt like that. I do have a simple late 18th century style men's shirt in linen. I've already got that. I wanted something different. So I went with cotton. I'm putting the pleats in the front. I'm doing some of the other attributes and designs that you expect from that, but the construction is still very, very similar to that of an 18th century shirt. It has not changed dramatically at this point. For the pattern itself, I based it off of a number of different resources, looking at original garments that I could find examples of, looking at some drafting manuals of the time, but there's not very much because most of the drafting manuals are really aimed at tailors and the clothing that they were making, which they're not making shirts, and a lot of the at-home things kind of focus more on like night shirts and stuff like that. There's only so much reference material that I could find for this era, so I wasn't able to find something I could specifically use, so I kind of made my own pattern and came up with it from there, which I do like what I came up with. I would amend it slightly. I am also going to take that pattern, digitize it, and put it up on my Patreon, so it will be available there. It is, of course, sized to me, but it's all squares, rectangles, and triangles, so it's not too hard to size up in many ways. But I really like how this shirt turned out. Just spoiler alert, I am very excited to be able to actually wear this shirt for everyday life because it's pretty nice. One of the fortunate things about this particular type of cotton is that it does rip straight across, so most of the pieces I was able to actually rip out of the cotton to get the straight edge, but some of the things are angled like the sleeves, so I have to cut those out. I also need to do the cuts to open up the front of the body, so the T shape that you see there goes across the middle fold section up at the top, and then it cuts straight down, and this gives us the opening for the neck that we will shape out later. And for this particular style, I also need a cut down at the bottom of the slit. That's because this portion will be pleated and gathered up in order to have the decorative front. The pleats are also drawn in with lines there, so I know where to fold and where to stitch. I started off by doing all of the pleats in front. I believe I have 5 per side, and they are around 1/2 inch or so wide. This was just decided by the amount of fabric that I had extra and what would look right with my body size. The center front edge is then finished off with a placket. This could be an extension of the actual shirt, but that felt like it was going to make the body piece way too wide in back and across the bottom, so I wanted to add this placket, which is done folded towards the front and then top stitched down. Again, if you were doing these things by hand, it's just being done with a backstitch. So this is mimicking a type of stitch that would have been used typically there to decoratively hold down and keep all of the edges from rolling back. This top stitching is functional as much as it is decorative. So there is the finished version where there's plackets on both sides, and those plackets will overlap and center up in the end. In order to add shape to the neckline, we use gussets rather than actually cutting a circle into the shirt body. This makes more sense to get over the muscles around your neck. The gussets are just a square of fabric that is cut diagonally in half to create 2 triangles. The edges are folded back and it is top stitched into place. If you were doing this by hand, you might use a felling stitch on the under portion and a top stitch on the top portion, but this opening just essentially gets sandwiched in between these 2 triangles. And then in my case, I chose to do a shoulder reinforcement strip that goes from the edge where the sleeve will connect all the way up the neckline. Again, I'm just top stitching this as it would have been commonly backstitched across. This is there to help reinforce an area that tends to get a lot of wear and tear, and to reinforce that corner where the split occurs and the gusset lines up. When it comes to gathering up the different portions, I chose to do this by hand because I much prefer the sort of gather I can get by hand and can stitch down by hand than by machine. Here I am gathering the body portion that will match up to those pleats down at the bottom. The finishing of this slit at the bottom is then done by way of 2 little rectangular pieces that are folded over the edges and felled down. This, again, did by hand because it allows me to catch all of those gathers individually, and it has a really nice clean appearance. Both the inside and the outside are done in this manner, so that way the raw edges are sandwiched in between the 2 layers. I did end up wishing that I had put the location of this horizontal cut a little bit lower. While I don't think it's too high for the period, I do wish it was lower purely because I would like to be able to wear this shirt with more modern clothing, and my trousers don't go up quite far enough to cover all the gathers. So if I was to do it again, I'd do it a couple inches lower. The sleeve seam is then run, leaving an opening down by the cuff. I am not putting a gusset in the underarm, so I'm not worried about that there, but this seam would have been done just simply by backstitch, about 1/4 inch from the edge. I then will roll back both of the open sections down at the cuff. I personally prefer the method where I roll one towards the outside and one towards the inside, and then the rest of the seam gets felled down. This is just the method that I like to use. There are lots of different ways that you can finish this section off, including clipping the seam so that way you can roll both of them towards the inside, or putting a little gusset there in order to close and finish that section off. This is just my preferred method of rolling one towards the outside, folding it over, and then actually rolling that entire seam solidly so that way one of them is towards the inside and it follows the seam the rest of the way. If I was doing this by hand, I would just simply be using a felling stitch instead of top stitching by machine. For me, this is just a way that I managed to finish it off very quickly and not have any raw edges that I need to worry about actually taking the time to finish off. The hem of the sleeve then gets gathered up to match with the cuff. Again, I'm doing this by hand. It allows me to get a really nice, tight, even gather, and that's especially important if you have a really oversized sleeve. Mine isn't, but it's a good habit. I will go ahead and fold back the seam allowances of the cuff because unlike modern stitching where you apply right side to right side and then stitch things together and fold them open, most of historical stitching by hand kind of gets done as a top stitch from the exterior. So I'm folding that back and marking out where the halfway point is for both the sleeve and the cuff. You can mark out more points than that if you want to. This just makes sure that your gathers are even, and the cuff's a pretty small section, so I'm not worried about quartering it and putting it into eighths or anything like that in order to match it up correctly. And then once it's gathered up, I just twist the thread back and forth over the pin at the end to hold it in place temporarily until everything is stitched down. And again, just like the body, the point of this is the fact that I can go along and fell down this cuff and catch every single one of those little gathers from both the outside and the inside, and it holds them perfectly into place, and it just looks so neat and clean, and you can cram so much fabric into such a little space. The other side of the cuff then gets folded back as well, folded up to those gathers, and like I said, we will fell that down. I will have to deal with the ends. You could technically do those by machine and then flip the thing, but I prefer, again, to do this section by hand. I'm already hand stitching around most of the cuff. Why not just add the ends as well? Those get folded back, and then I will just simply do a little felling stitch over those ends as well. So it's the same sort of stitch that I'm doing the whole way around the cuff as it is, and it's somewhere between that angular felling stitch and a slip stitch. So this is the final version. As you can see, one flips to the inside and one flips to the outside, and depending on which that is, it will be the right or the left sleeve. Next, I'm moving on to doing the exact same thing to the collar that I just did to the sleeves. The only difference here is that because the collar is in two pieces, it has shaping, I am going ahead and machine stitching it right side to right side and flipping it correct side out, because it does have a little curve at the front. Most of the 18th century and earlier shirts that I've seen have just a straight rectangular collar. You can do that in one piece, fold it over, but as we get a little further in, they tend to have this little extension and curve in the front, which will have a little buttonhole down in that extended curved section. Eventually, you will start seeing historically a lot of options for collars where this little extension is actually a small band and the larger piece is buttoned onto that band in order to get the correct collar shape. I also want to note here that I would change up how I gather around the neckline. I don't like that I had to gather the gussets, and instead I would rather gather across the back into those gussets next time. I'd rather run those gathers across the back there, and I would make that change the next time so it looks a little bit cleaner. Now, having finished the collar, I then move on to inserting those sleeves. Like I said, they are a more narrow style, so I'm not gathering the sleeves into the body of the shirt, nor do I have an underarm gusset. Then we're going ahead and doing up the side seams, no different than I did up the sleeve seams. So those will get turned and felled down, and the bottom opening will get done in the same way. The raw seam that you have around where the sleeve and the body meet gets dealt with by way of a facing. This can be a very narrow band, about 1 inch like I'm doing, or it can be a very wide piece. If you are someone that tends to wear the shoulders and chest area and back of their shirt a lot, this is where having that extra layer can be really, really helpful. Again, I'm going in by hand and felling this down because usually you don't see this top stitched. It's just sort of a prick stitch through the outside, and I'm trying to mimic most of the stitches that would have been done historically. This little facing extends down over the seam a bit just to cover up that little corner at the bottom of where the bottom of the sleeve or the bottom of the gusset matches up with the body. Again, these facings are not only for finishing off the seams, but also for that extra reinforcement, so they really are necessary. The very bottom of the body is just turned and hemmed. I do find some references that say that they like to make the front of the body a little bit shorter than the back, so keep that in mind early on if you're patterning things out and deciding where to cut your slits, or you can simply trim back the front edge a little bit. Another place to put a little gusset is at the bottom of the body. This is because this area gets a fair amount of stress as we're tucking the front and the back between the legs and pulling the trousers up over it. So this is an area that is good to have a little bit of reinforcement. Most of the time I see this version where there's a folded over square, it turns into a triangle, and then it is just applied to the interior. And it's felled down, top stitched down. You can fold the corners in to keep them clean there. However you want to finish it off. Sometimes these are right up against the edge like I'm doing, where they're only set about 1/4 of an inch in. Sometimes they're set at an angle completely different than the actual body and are just this little triangle that sits over that split at the bottom for reinforcement. I'm personally just top stitching from both the exterior and the interior, so that way it's got 2 lines of stitching holding it down and reinforcing it. Again, this is just a matter of strength. Then we move on to the buttons and buttonholes. The front can have as many buttons and buttonholes as you feel is necessary. Obviously 1 up at the collar, and I decided to just put 2 along the chest, but more than that is also fine. Those are vertical buttonholes for the chest portion. For the cuffs, you just make sure that the buttonholes are on the top side of your cuff and match up with the size of your button. You don't want them much larger than your button, simply because it makes it too easy for them to pop out, especially with those vertical buttonholes on the front. There are lots of different ways to finish off your buttonholes. I'm choosing to do bar tacks at both ends because I like the visual nature of that, but rounding off the ends is also really common, especially on shirts, though I don't think I've seen any keyhole buttons done on shirts at this time, though the keyhole button is coming into play around this era. I also don't have any reinforcements in the cuffs or the collar. I could have put some sort of interfacing in there, but I don't find it necessary in the case of this particular textile, and a little bit of starching can go a really long way in giving me stiffness that is going to make more sense than putting a whole heavy layer of interfacing in between. I'm just matching up where the button needs to sit. Most of the buttons that I've seen on older shirts tend to either be thread buttons, shell buttons, something really simple. The 2-hole button is definitely the more common version that I've seen on older shirts. I have yet to see a 4-hole button used earlier than probably mid-19th century, but again, this is not something I've really researched, so don't take my word on that. This is just something to pay attention to. I do actually have a 3-hole button in my collection as well of antiques. I don't know how that's supposed to work, but it fascinates me greatly. So I just went with a 2-hole little shell button. These are modern buttons that you can regularly get, so I don't have to worry about accidentally damaging an antique as this goes through the wash. So it's pretty easy to replace. And I did put a little bit of a thread shank on this just to deal with the bulk since it is such a flat button.